I'm actually stepping up here to welcome our governors of the bank, the ministers of finance. I see the vice president of the World Bank and treasurer of the World Bank Group here, my sister Aruma Ote here, and executive directors of the African Development Bank that are here this morning. But I want to let you know that as you came in, you see that somebody differently dressed than the rest of us, and that's because he's different from the rest of us. He is our special royal guest for this event. His Royal Highness, the Emir of Kano, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. Please put your hands together for him. So who is Sanusi Lamido Sanusi? Emir of Kano was first a central bank governor. He was central bank governor of Nigeria from 2009 to 2014. And as central bank governor of Nigeria, he distinguished himself. He was named the Time magazine, among the Time magazine 100 most influential people in the world for 2011. He won the Global Central Bank Governor of the Year for the world and for Africa in 2011 from the Banker magazine and from Financial Times. He also won the Central Bank Governor of the Year for all of Sub-Saharan Africa and emerging markets for 2011 to 2013. He was also the Central Bank Governor of the Year for the Africa Banker magazine for all of Africa for 2013. Emir Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, our Central Bank Governor, helped a lot in Nigeria. He helped to stabilize the exchange rate. He kept inflation down. He attracted significant amount of foreign direct investment, and my sister Aruma Ote is there to testify to that. But beyond that, he was a pro-development central bank governor. His pulse, his heart, his mind, his intellect, very sharp like anything else, was focused on how to improve the lives of people. For me, the most important and most exciting part was our central bank governor. He used development finance to direct to critical sectors like agriculture, like infrastructure, like small and medium-sized enterprises, and also for energy. I haven't seen any central bank governor that actually gets so much into development like I've seen our central bank governor, Sanusi Lamido. We worked together, and how did I know him? At that time, he wasn't wearing the royal garbs. He was wearing, at that time, bow tie just like myself. I met him in Austria. I'd never seen him before. And I was making a case for how we should get central banks and other financial institutions to do risk lending to agricultural sector to leverage more money. And when I looked, I saw this handsome man that was sitting out there with his bow tie. At the end of my talk, he walked up to me, he said, "I am Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, Central Bank Governor of Nigeria, and I would like you to come to Nigeria to put those things that you have just said into action." Of course, what do you do when somebody walks up to you and tells you that? And that was how I came to Nigeria. That was the time they were having the cloud, all this thing in Europe and so on. I landed in Nigeria. The rest is history. His leadership was remarkable. He helped us to put together what's called the Nigerian Incentive-Based Risk Lending for Agriculture. And it's called NISAL. He brought together all the MDs of banks in Nigeria, chief group risk officers. He put aside $350 million to do risk lending to agriculture in Nigeria. And that NISAL facility ended up leveraging 10 times, $3.5 billion into the agriculture sector and agricultural value chains. And today, Emir, the African Development Bank is actually extending that to several African countries. Thanks for your great work, Sanusi Lamido. Today, what does the Emir do? His heart and pulse is still in development. Today, he is the chairman of Science and Technology and Innovation Board of the Islamic Development Bank. He's also the chairman of Black Rhino. That's a private equity fund that's investing in power across African countries. He sits on so many boards. He sits also on the board as chairman of Babanguna, which is something on agriculture. I don't know any other part of the world where the managing director of the IMF will come into a country, and the first place they want to go is the royal palace of an emir to talk about macroeconomic issues even before they see the central bank governor. That is the Royal Highness Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the emir. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Governors, Excellencies, and I'm pleased to be back at ADB. A few years ago, I gave a speech like this at a dinner, African Development Bank, in Tunis. And I was dressed very much like my friend and brother, Akinwumi Adesina. But I'm happy to be back, and I thank ADB for this invitation. Just a little bit of a health warning for those who know me. Sometimes I say things that annoy people. In my new role, I can't afford to be controversial, but I have a very good excuse. I'm very much jet-lagged. So if anyone is annoyed by anything I say, please, it's the time difference. Forgive me. I've been asked to speak about domestic resource mobilization and industrialization. Over the past 2 decades, economic development in most African countries has been marked by 2 somewhat contradictory features. One feature has been a significant reduction in many countries of extreme poverty, largely due to rising commodity prices, better macroeconomic management, debt relief, greater political stability, and some improvements in the business environment. But the second contradictory feature has been a failure to achieve structural transformation towards sectors with higher value addition. Industrialization has proven elusive in Africa. And in fact, the share of manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa has fallen from 19% of GDP in 1975 to 11% in 2014. In big economies like Nigeria, manufacturing is less than 10%. Yet structural transformation towards sectors with higher value addition has proven vital in the transition towards middle and high income status in all countries. This is why this matter is of great concern. We will not be able to achieve improvements in living standards over the long term and attain the middle income status that all of us aspire to if we are unable to diversify our economies towards industries with high value added. And these need to be in line with our relative comparative advantage and carry the potential for a continued transformation towards gradually more sophisticated products. In the decades after independence, many African countries tried to develop industries that were the strength of advanced nations, and that failed and led to much waste of resources. We must not go back there, but instead build on our inherent strengths, abundant natural resources, and a youth bulge that will allow us to be competitive in many labor-intensive industries. And I think very often we underestimate the importance of structural change and structural transformation. I always give the example of China, and it's something that's very close to me personally. In 1972, my father was Nigeria's first ambassador to China. I still remember the pictures of his residence in Beijing. And I still remember that in 1972, my father had to go to Hong Kong twice a month in order to buy essential commodities because they were not available in Peking. By the time Deng started opening up in China, China had 700 million Chinese living in poverty. Today, 40 years later, the number is down to about 30 million. When Deng started, China had only 8 million graduates in China. Today, the Chinese have more than 300 million graduates, or their equivalent, higher than the population of the United States. Most of us do not remember that just as recently as 1980s, the per capita income of China was lower than that of Mozambique and lower than that of Ethiopia. This is one generation. I look at what China has done, and it has all done it because of structural transformation. This is why the conversation on industrialization is one that we must have. But we cannot have it, industrialization, without also funding, talk about finance. And when we talk about domestic resources, we talk about both public finance and private investment. Now, where do we begin? Let's talk about revenue to GDP. I know, and this is a concern for most finance ministers, everywhere we talk about Africa with very low revenue to GDP ratios. The truth is that the numbers are not the same across the board. There's such a wide divergence in revenue to GDP ratios in Africa, and I think we should look at those numbers critically and begin to ask ourselves, what are some countries doing right and what are others doing wrong? The range is from 6% revenue to GDP ratio in Nigeria, my country, to more than 40% in Seychelles. Now, I'm going to speak a lot, I'm sure I'll give examples from Nigeria for two reasons. One, Nigeria is a country I know best, but two, with 6% revenue to GDP ratio, it's important to look at what that country has done wrong and what it needs to do, and what other countries need to do in order to improve. The median for sub-Saharan Africa is actually 18%. And for broader emerging markets, it is 23%. So we're looking at a gap of 3 to 5% on the average in Africa. When you compare, say, Nigeria to other oil-producing countries, the average among all exporters is 27%. So when you look at those numbers, you begin to get concerned, to get disturbed, don't you, about only 6% of your GDP coming as revenue. Now, one of the first things I did was, when I looked at these numbers, I went to the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index and tried to do a check. The countries that had very high revenue to GDP ratios, the countries that had low revenue to GDP ratios, and where they ranked on the index. And lo and behold, you know the answer. In most cases, those countries that seem to be doing well and seem to be showing marked improvements in revenue GDP ratios are the same countries that are doing very well on the Transparency Index. And those countries that don't seem to be getting anywhere are those that are not doing well. I actually have some names here, but I don't think we're in a name and shame environment. Anybody can check those numbers. But if you just take a few examples, since I won't be accused of shaming anyone, and this is reality. If you go to the TI index, you would see many of these countries who have very low revenue GDP ratios, like Nigeria, DRC, the CAR, Burundi, Chad, Eritrea, Madagascar, Uganda. They rank very low on that index, and they also rank low here. Then countries like Seychelles, Lesotho, Namibia, Botswana, who rank very high on that index, also seem to have very high revenue to GDP ratio. So the first thing I think, and the reason I'm saying this is every time we talk about revenues, we talk about broadening the tax base, we talk about increasing VAT, we talk about customs and excise, and we'll talk about that. But maybe we don't talk about the real elephant in the room and some of the issues we need to talk about. And number one issue is that there seems to me to be a very clear correlation between the level of transparency and good governance in public financial management and the ability of a country to raise these revenues. So this is one thing we need to talk about honestly and sincerely if we actually want to address this in Africa. The second issue is, and this has to do with analysts, we look at numbers, take the deficit numbers, and I've always seen this when countries go to issue bonds in the markets, analysts look at deficit to GDP. The problem is that nations do not pay debt out of GDP. And because analysts are not looking at the right numbers, we don't seem to have we're not pushing the right buttons and putting the right pressure on governments. So let me give an example. Nigeria has a debt to GDP of 6%. Kenya has, revenue to GDP of 6%. Kenya has revenue to GDP of 18%. Senegal has revenue to GDP of 24%. A 3% deficit to GDP in Nigeria is the equivalent of 9% in Kenya, 12% in Senegal. But if you just looked at Kenya and said 6% deficit to GDP, Nigeria 3%, you think this is better. But Nigeria is actually much worse off with a deficit of 3% to GDP, given that its revenues are only 6% of GDP, than Kenya would be with an 8% deficit to GDP ratio. And because we're not looking at those numbers, we're not pushing the right buttons or putting the right pressure. The same thing with this farcical number, debt to GDP ratio. When I was governor of Central Bank, I never understood why anyone, coming from a risk management perspective, why anyone would be talking about servicing debt from GDP if you service debt from revenues. But debt to GDP numbers seem to be, I know people look at countries, oh, it's only 15% debt to GDP, only 20% debt to GDP. But in fact, only 15% of your GDP is paying taxes, maybe only the oil sector and the formal sector. If you take agriculture, if you take wholesale and retail trade, if you take services, you might find that 60% of economic activity simply does not pay taxes. So it's totally irrelevant for the purpose of assessing your debt capacity. And these are critical when we deal with the fiscal space and resource mobilization. And when we begin to push those buttons, I think we begin to push financial managers into looking at the right numbers. And this is why today, countries that are generating 6% revenue to GDP still have budgets where they think they can have a deficit of 3% to GDP, and it looks good. And then what is the result? At the end of the day, you end up spending, as my country did at one time, 40, maybe 50% of your revenue on debt service. Where is the money for industrialization? Where is the money for education? Where is the money for infrastructure? Where is the money for healthcare if half of the revenue is already gone servicing debt? Now, these are the kinds of challenges that you have by not looking at these numbers properly. Now, the second element after governance that I'd like to look at before I come to broaden tax bases, what do we do with the money that we already collect? Because I see in many cases, every African head of state will tell you he wants to industrialize. Every African finance minister says he wants industrialization. But the only way to know who is serious from who is not is to look at what they do with the money that they have. So a number of African countries have done extremely well. And I always doff my hat to Ethiopia and MLS. You look at the work that's been done by Kagame in Rwanda. You look at some of the work that's been done in Côte d'Ivoire. We can see some of the fastest growing African nations are the ones that are beginning to diversify at a very fast rate. Unfortunately, most of those countries put together do not account for maybe more than 20% of African GDP. If the economies that were growing very fast in Africa were the big economies, would make much more progress today than we're making now. African growth is slow largely because the fast-growing economies are the small economies, but they're the ones that are doing the right thing. So Akin was very kind. He said I was central bank governor until 2014. He didn't say I was fired. And, you know, and the battles that I fought, for which I was fired, are battles I've continued fighting, because the things, there has been improvement, there has been change, but we've not moved far from where we're supposed to be. My country, in the last 2-3 years, has spent 1.4 trillion naira on petroleum subsidies. This was one of the reasons I was fired. We were spending at one time $6 billion between petroleum subsidies and all sorts of leakages. Now, when you think that someone who is faced with challenges of industrialization, power, agriculture, irrigation, education, healthcare, maternal mortality, infant mortality, actually thinks that his priority is to spend money on petroleum subsidies. You've got to ask questions. Imagine ₦1 trillion, what it would have done for industry, what it would have done for education and for health. And this has been going on for decades. And this is ₦1 trillion at a time when oil price was low. And we still continue in many African countries to have this misallocation of resources. So it's not even so much not raising enough money, but not doing the right thing. We've got huge public service expenditures. We've got, and the reason I'm saying this is these soft issues do have economic consequences. We have a constitution in my country that says there must be a president and a vice president. There must be a minister from every state. We have 36 states. We have 109 senators, 360 members of the House of Representatives. Every state has a governor and a deputy governor and a state legislature. Okay, an average of 30 across 36 states. We have 774 local governments. Each has a chairman and 9 councillors and a speaker. I mean, just look at that. This is a constitutional, these are constitutional offices. The president, no matter how prudent he is, no matter how thoughtful he is, has to maintain these offices. And we're surprised that 80% of government revenue goes to public service workers. If you're spending 80% of your income on workers, how do you free up money for industrialization? So while we talk about how do we raise more money, how do we impose more taxes on Africans, rich and poor, okay, more likely poor, okay, while we think about that, we might as well ask, what have we been doing with the money that we've received? How do we begin to change, adopt these attitudes on these soft issues that consume money and force us to divert resources away from priority areas? A third soft issue. Nobody wants to talk about it. When China had the one-child policy, you know, people object to it, that's fine. But you know, if you're growing at 3% and your population is growing at 4%, you're never going to have money for industrialization. You know, the issue of demography has to be looked at. You know, how do we look at demographic growth? The age at which our daughters get married, the number of wives we marry. I'm not a good example, but but then I'm a king, I'm allowed it. You know, the number of children that we produce. And you know, we keep increasing this population. My country has a population of 180 million. The median age is 19. In the next 20 years, Nigeria will have 90 million people between the ages of 20 and 40. That is more than the population of Germany, the third largest economy in the world. And so just think of it. What kind of economy do you need to build for these young people? And if you keep producing them, how are you going to expand at a rate that is fast enough to build their per capita income? So all the countries in the world that went through this transition did not just, and we're getting into a classic Malthusian situation. I'm not saying that our problem is just demography, but it is one of those things that you need to look at. You need to look at how you improve your collection, how you allocate those resources, and how you control your population growth in order to begin to see the benefits of these increased revenues. Now, time to go to what you might call the low-hanging fruit. And you know, while I give examples of Nigeria, I'm sure many of us are doing a lot of thinking in our brains and saying, it's also my country. Okay, so it's just polite for me to use Nigeria. I can use many other examples here. Now, take our country, excise duty and customs. Nigeria today collects 0.2% of GDP from customs duty, compared to 2.5% in the rest of ECOWAS. We're an oil-producing country. We import a lot. The duties aren't there. Now, part of the problem is trade policy. You know, we have a whole range of products that are banned. And we have tariffs on some things like rice, very high tariffs to protect. Some of it due to, I think, Akin wanted rice protected when he was agric minister. And I remember having that debate. You increase the tariffs in Nigeria, what happens? Where does the rice come? It comes through Cotonou. Today, the Republic of Benin is one of the world's largest consumer of rice. All that rice comes to Nigeria. The rice that goes through Cotonou is not even eaten by the Beninois. And it's not just rice. You know, we have a big drug problem in Nigeria. And the Republic of Benin today is, after the United States, the world's largest importer of tramadol. But the drug problem is not a problem in Benin. It comes in. So when you have a customs service that cannot stop tramadol from coming in, and you want to ban toothpicks, you know, everything comes in. So if you ban a product in Nigeria and don't seal the borders, you simply give up revenue. The goods come in. They come in at a higher price because people then pay the price of smuggling and the risks they take and bribing customs. So you increase the price of those goods. You don't succeed in banning them. All the goods that are prohibited are available all over the streets. They're all over. We get imported rice. We have toothpicks. We have imported furniture. People have Italian furniture, Turkish furniture in their homes everywhere. They didn't come through the Nigerian ports, but they got into Nigeria. Now, why don't we just go back to a sensible trade policy where we have a tariff that is consistent with the rest of West Africa and allow those goods in? And then you can choose other means of promoting local industry if that is objective. So that's one way where you kind of shoot yourself in the foot. And countries then need to look at what their policy is. Which brings me to the question of the common trade framework for Africa. This is why every African country needs to sign to that framework. If we can sign to that framework, if we can have a way of taking Africa as a bloc and negotiating with the rest of the world, we would be much better off than each country trying to develop its own trade policy. You know, it's just, the borders are just too porous. And I was speaking to a few finance ministers in Washington last month, and I said, you know, if the ADB could get African trade ministers together, if we can start negotiating with China as Africa, because I just think of China sitting across the table, and on the other side is Senegal, and it's supposed to be an equal exchange. It doesn't happen, you know, but maybe we should have Africa negotiating with China. It becomes more balanced. And the reason we need to talk to China is the following. One is, we now know from Donald Trump that even the very powerful countries in the world are concerned about their trade deficits. You may not like Trump, but what he has done is he has torn up the rule book on the free markets, on complete liberalization of trade, and he has told us that markets are not necessarily level playing fields. I remember giving this anecdote in my talk to the African Development Bank in Tunisia several years ago. I said, you know, you can have a football match and you have the Brazilian national team and the under-16 national team for Nigeria. The playing field is level, but you know who's going to win. And this is what we have with the World Trade Organization, with all the agreements we have signed. There is nothing like a level playing field. America today is being battered by China. Now, how about us, Africa? 9 out of 10 African countries have a huge trade deficit with China. If you take where we are today and where China is, we have a golden opportunity for redefining that relationship. China is moving out of low-value, labor-intensive industries. It has to. It has to take the path of Japan and Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong. In the 1980s, when I was a credit officer in the banking industry, labor costs in China were $80 a month in the textiles industry compared to $100 a month in Nigeria. Today, labor costs in China are 5 times labor costs in Nigeria. China has to move out of those industries if it is to remain competitive. When China moves out of those industries and outsources the production in those industries, that is 100 million jobs at least that can come to Africa. So we talk about industrialization. That is the industrial model. And this is, we have the same endowments China had when it started in the 1980s. A large pool of unskilled labor, a youth bulge, natural resources. Now, those are the industries we need to develop. Absorb rural labor, improve agricultural productivity, leverage our comparative advantage, and then exploit this huge domestic and international market. That is the only way Africa can achieve the structural reform that it wants. Now, but the way to do it, I think, is for us collectively to engage China and see how we can organize this structure. It's happening in places. Ethiopia has textiles, has leather. I think Madagascar has garments. Okay, but we can do much more. Garments, textiles, footwear, commodities, agro-allied industries, plastics. There's so much that we can do and just move from China to Africa. And I think this is one way to boost industrialization. The second thing is we talk about industries, industrialization, and we lose sight of what the government needs to do in terms of externalities and coordination. And this is when we come to private financing. Private capital wants to come into industry, but the environment has to be created. And this is where the example of NERSL, even though it's agric, will be very helpful. When I first saw Akin in Vienna, this was in, 2010? He was giving a talk just like this at lunch and talking about all the things in Agra they had done with agriculture in Zambia and to get finance into companies like Zambeef. And actually, when I confronted him, what I said was, how come you did all this in Zambia when you're a Nigerian? And you haven't done it in Nigeria. And he said, well, I've been trying to get Nigeria to do this, and no one is listening to me. I said, okay. Then I said, okay, look, come, you have a partner. I had spent my life before the central bank as a risk officer, as a chief risk officer in banks. And I'd spent 95% of that time saying no to agricultural loans because agriculture simply was not ready for lending. And all the concerns that I had were the concerns he was talking about. Fixing that entire value chain and de-risking it so that money could come in. Now, obviously, if you're in a bank, you can't do that. You have to be in a policy-making position. This is why the people in this room are extremely important. The difference between being a CEO of a commercial bank and a governor of central bank is as CEO of a commercial bank, I had to decide whether to lend or not lend. As governor of central bank, I could change the circumstances in which banks could lend and make sure that we de-risk it. And this was where, and that's why finance ministers, central bank governors are so important. If you look at South Africa, people talk about Nelson Mandela, and he was great for the political transition, great for our history. But the real economic power of South Africa came from Thabo Mbeki, Trevor Manuel, Tito Mboweni. Those 3 M's, assisted by Pravin Gordhan. At the end of the day, if you have your central banking and your finance right, you're able to achieve so much that the entire private sector cannot on its own. And this is why it's important. So we worked. He was in the Ministry of Agriculture. I was in the central bank. We worked on de-risking agriculture, and we moved lending from 0 to 10% of bank balance sheets in a few years. And it has continued. And the model has been replicated. Now, this is agriculture, but the same thing happens with industry. How did Dubai begin? They set up an aluminium plant based on their gas resources. And Dubai, the UAE continues with that model every time. You want to go into an industry, you make sure you take care of the coordination issues and externality issues. If I come to Nigeria and I want to set up a garment factory, I want to be financing a garment factory. I'm not a power plant. I don't want to produce my own electricity. I'm not a construction company. I don't want to build my own roads. I'm not the armed forces. I don't want to provide my own security. So somebody has to provide all those other things so that when you bring an investor into garments, you bring an investor into leather products, you bring an investor into petrochemicals, they know that that is what they're investing in. They're not coming to invest in your power, in your security, in your roads, in transportation, and at the end of the day, find that 50, 60% of the resources they bring are not going to the core business. Now, some people have done that. Dangote famously starts from the position that there will be no externalities taken. He internalizes everything. So his cement plant, he built his gas pipeline from the Niger Delta all the way to Ajokuta. He built the factory. He built his power plant. He built the roads. He built the houses for his staff. And that is his model. In fact, that is the Dangote model. He internalizes that which nobody else can afford to internalize. And that's why he's the richest man in Africa. He's today building a refinery, a petrochemical plant, a fertilizer complex, and building a 3,000 or 500 kilometer pipeline from east to west to produce the gas and power and sell electricity to Lagos. Now, how many people can raise $10 billion, $20 billion, $30 billion? And if you say that is the model, you're never going to get it. Now, we have Dangote in Nigeria, and just to tell you how difficult it is to replicate it, when I was in the bank and we did some projections, by the time the Dangote Group completes its petrochemical plant, one company, one group, will account for 60% of Nigeria's manufacturing GDP. That is frightening. It's good to have a Dangote, but it's frightening to think that 60% of the GDP of a country like Nigeria comes from one group. With a serious, I used to call him Nigeria's key man risk. Now we need to have diversification. You need to create externalities and coordination that will allow people who don't have the pockets of Dangote to go into industries, that have comparative advantage. And this is where I think we need to, some countries have done extremely well. If you take what Ethiopia did with coffee, what they did with leather, you can see it was basically identifying a growth area, finding out what you need to facilitate that growth, and then doing it. And and again, I keep saying, look at China. Today, you have consolidation going on with Chinese generation companies. Why? Because China is generating more power than the demand for it. Meanwhile, Africa needs power. How do we get these companies to come and generate power in Africa? And please don't listen to those telling you not to do coal plants. 80% of US power is coal. I know we're all doing all this renewable, that's fine. But listen, we need the coal now. If we have the coal, produce the power. We will go into green energy later when we get to that level of per capita income. China is doing coal. By all means, get environmentally friendly technology, But this jumping on the bandwagon, you know, when people jump on this bandwagon and say we want to do renewables, we don't want to do coal, what percentage of US electricity is from renewables? It's large. They still have coal plants. China. So we need to look at these things. And of course, if you do renewables, come to Kano, we have a lot of sun. So solar, you know, would love to have those investments, and that's something we should look at. The final thing I would like to say, and is in this issue of good thinking on policy, is to look at the history of Africa, and this is where, and again we'll go back to China. You know, Xi Jinping talks about the Silk Road. It's time. You know, sorry, you know, you get me all the way here. You have to let me talk. So I'll make one final point. You know, they told me to speak for 20 minutes. That's less than 1% of the number of hours I spent on the plane coming here. You know, it's just. I told them. So I'll speak for 20 minutes by my watch, and you know. So. Okay, but I think I need to make this point. I like making this point because I have all these finance ministers in this office, and it's extremely important. You know, if you look at West and North Africa, if you look at the area called the Sahel today, it's one big black box. If you look at all those countries, all the prosperity is on the coast. Okay, you look at city, you look at Lagos, Cotonou, Abidjan, Lomé, Dakar, Casablanca, you know, Algiers, Sfax, all those cities. Why? Because African growth has been focused on trading with Europe. Now you go back 500 years ago, all that trade was trans-Sahara. That disappeared with the steamship, it disappeared with colonialism. And we've not, as Africans, considered the implications of that black hole. So you have one part of Africa that was historically the richest part. Kano, my city, was the third largest city in Africa after Cairo and Fez. For centuries. It was the only city in sub-Saharan Africa that had a large market. It was the center of trans-Saharan trade. Today, you've got the large population, you've got the commerce, but you don't have the per capita income, you don't have the economic growth. And it's the same across the northern parts of Ghana, the northern parts of Cameroon, northern parts of Benin, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Senegal. Even within countries, when you look at Nigeria today, the southwest of Nigeria has poverty levels of 20%. 20% is the incidence of poverty in the southwest. In the northwest, it's 80%. It's one country, but it's effectively two different countries. Okay? The north of Tunisia is much wetter than the south. I keep teasing my friends from Tunis that they think they're from the south of France, you know, because it's all facing north. It's time for Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and those to begin to look south, and for us to also begin to look north and to develop that region. Because all the issues that we have in Africa, migration, and we've jumped on this migration bandwagon. You know, I'm glad you didn't ask me to talk about migration because, you know, I think we should get as many Africans as possible to migrate to Europe and share in the prosperity. You know, it's, you know, look, it's a European problem. When the Europeans came here in the 16th century and took Africans on boats, migration was not a bad thing to work on plantations. When they settled in Algeria and in South Africa and in our countries as colonialists, migration was not a bad thing. Why is it suddenly bad? It's bad because Africans now want to share, and you know this discourse we have. It's fine for capital to migrate. It's fine for you to bring in money, take out your profits, take out your dividends. You know, we want liberalization of capital flows. However, human beings cannot migrate. I can sit in New York, invest money in Algeria, invest money in Nigeria, invest money in Kenya, make a profit, but the Algerian and the Kenyan and the Nigerian cannot come and share in that prosperity. And everywhere we're all sitting as Africans, having conferences, as if is anybody migrating to Nigeria? It's not my problem. You know, it has become our number one problem. The European problem is our problem. What we need to do is ask these guys to look at the economic structures that they have created. Let us create a more equal world. Create some prosperity so people don't want to run. What is it that makes someone leave his country? Risk all the dangers, including slavery, commercial sex. What kind of pressure pushes people to seek green pastures in another world? The point I'm making is we should sign up to this Silk Road idea. African countries need to fast track it. Let's build infrastructure connecting the Sahel. Let us revive those trans-Saharan routes. Let us improve trade within Africa and stop looking to the outside world for our growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Clear, succinct leadership, ladies and gentlemen, and inspiring always to hear you, Your Royal Highness. So thank you very much. And also for bringing it all down to what we really need to talk about and not staying at that theoretical level. So on that note, if I could ask the following people to please join us on stage. The Honorable Abdourahmane Rayouya, the Minister of Finance, Algeria. The Honorable Bahane Habtemariam, the Minister of Finance, Eritrea. And joined also by the Honorable Aya Eza Nasilia Gomes de Silva, Secretary of State for Budget and Public Investment of Angola. Thank you very much for joining us on the stage. Minister Habtemariam, if you could give us Eritrea's stance, just still staying on this transparency issue and how your government, sir, is clamping down on corruption, given the importance when it comes to attracting resources.
Thanking the President of the African Development Bank to have given us this opportunity to share our experience in domestic resource mobilization to finance industrialization, and also I would like to thank the hospitality accorded to us by the Korean government and people. On corruption, unfortunately, Eritrea is ranked on the lower part of the Transparency International, but I really do not agree to such classification because there isn't any rampant corruption in Eritrea. There is a zero tolerance policy for corruption in Eritrea. Having said that, it doesn't mean there isn't corruption at all. I mean, here and there you could have some corrupt officials, but the way Eritrea has been portrayed by Transparency International and other institutions is not correct. They don't have the right information or data of the country. I mean, Eritrea is, a relatively young country, not that so young. It's celebrating its 27th anniversary this week, actually. And unfortunately, it was only for the first 7 years that we had some peace, some respite. And during those first 7 years, our economy was developing between 7 and 8%, and we started from a zero base of economic development, and we're doing great. Unfortunately, we had to go to second round of conflict with Ethiopia. So now over 20 years that we have been at war and at no peace, no war situation over the last 20 years. Unfortunately, we had to divert quite a lot of our resources to the defense of the country, and that has created a very difficult situation for our economic development, because relatively Eritrea is a small country of 3.5 million people, confronted by a much larger power to the south, which is also backed by the big powers. So, you know.
So, Minister, you had to use a lot of your existing resources to defend your country, which goes to the point that His Royal Highness made. The second element was the utilization of resources as they stand in order to beget additional resources. I'm coming back to you in a moment. Madam Secretary, if I could get you to come in here on Angola's stance and perhaps just adding on both of those elements. Again, transparency being number one, and two, utilization of existing resources from an Angolan perspective.
Thank you to the ADB president and staff for inviting us for this panel. Thank you for the government of Korea for such a good and welcoming staying in this country. Well, and thank you for your such a brave and beautiful speech this morning. Coming to the question directly, we as a country have a new government that came into power just 8 months ago, let's say. And I think that it has been on the news internationally that this government has been making some deep changes in order to restructure the way the government in Angola does things. So we are known for being a very corrupt country. We understand that, and we also understand that is our aim as government now to change this perception. As such, there is a number of reforms that we have doing on the last 6 months. Some of them have been with the help of the international partners, and including the ADB and the other institutions. Most of them have been on the oil sector, on the macroeconomic, fiscal and monetary policies, the way the government and the main actors deal with public resources. So we understand that it's important to change the way others perceive us. And we have been working hard in order to change the environment. On the way that we utilize resources, during his speech, Emir said that being polite, he was only mentioning Nigeria, but as he was speaking, I was like, he maybe is from Angola. I don't know. He just doesn't understand or he doesn't know. Because most of what he was saying, it's totally related to us. I think that being oil export countries, we have pretty much a lot in common. So it's like he said, we have such a huge categories on the budget that pretty much none is left to any more savings, public savings, in order to put into the industry development. But let me say that as country, we also experience the reverse of the coin. So we also experience periods where the government has put a lot of money into the process of modernization, investment of the industries, big, small, in order to capacitate its own people, and it just didn't happen. So he mentioned the example of China, and if I could come out with a huge teaching on what he said this morning, is that probably education is a key to this process, because as he said, China has had 8 million of people with a degree 20 or 30 years ago. Today they have 300 million. So probably the key is education, because I personally believe that the lack of knowledge on how to deal with the industry challenges and management policies on the industry field that is required for a country to strive, I will not say for the whole Africa, but at least in Angola, we lack it. Because
and I think, Madam Secretary, if I can interject and bring it to His Royal Highness now, education has to be at the base of our policies, the knowledge economy and the skills that you referred to, Sir, earlier. Also, of course, the young population in terms of creating the skills necessary for them to inject into the workforce down the line. Given that first round, you're set, because now remember, we're building two solutions. We don't want to leave this stage without realizing what is best practice and how can we fast track Africa. I love the idea that you built on earlier of brand Africa approaching China as a consolidated group.
You know, the issue of human resources is extremely important, human capital, and the realization that if you invest in a human being, you're actually creating capital. Part of the problem is planning. Again, I give examples of Nigeria. A few months ago, we had this forum where people talk about human capital. And I said, let me ask a simple question. Is there anywhere in Nigeria where I can lay my hands on data of, say, graduates of Nigerian universities in the last 20 years, the number of graduates, and the fields they studied, and the relevance of those fields to our economy? And nobody has the data. Now, if you don't know how many engineers, there was a time China stopped people from saying anything apart from engineering because they needed engineers. Okay? What do we need to develop and who do we produce? You go to African countries, people are studying philosophy and asking themselves, how do I know that I exist? You exist because you're hungry, you know? I mean, look, the guy, he studies philosophy. If he doesn't get a job at the university, he cannot farm, he cannot do anything. And he's asking, how do I know I exist? I mean, it's not the question that we should be asking ourselves at this point in time, okay? Second thing is the way we have defined education. Now, in Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, for example, the language has become an education. People forget that language is just a tool, okay? So I keep arguing, if you've got 70% of your population living in rural areas, if they speak local languages, Hausa, Yoruba, Swahili, what have you, why don't you give them that education in their local language? Why do they need to study English or French? Do they speak English to the cattle and to the land when they're farming, or to the chicken? So you want to develop human resources, you've also got to remove yourself from that post-colonial mindset, okay, where if you don't speak English, then you can't get an education. The Chinese produce doctors in Chinese, they don't speak English. People in Taiwan, people in Korea, they don't have to speak English. They're doctors, they're engineers.
Your Royal Highness, I want to, because I've got a very stringent agenda that I want to achieve here. And I think the one thing that we haven't unpacked appropriately is when we talk about domestic resources and mobilizing domestic resources, can you give color to what we are talking about here? I mean, we can throw in pension funds and we can throw in all different asset bases, stock market capitalization. But let's put some real visuals to what we're talking about in terms of domestic resources. And then I'm going to get everybody to add on the panel. So if you could kick that off, sir.
Okay, so the first thing is if we deal with the issue of getting yourselves more transparent, making sure that revenue goes into the government and then allocating the resources properly. You're not talking about how do you increase and how do you raise that revenue base. On the government side, you certainly are looking at things like VAT, okay? My country has 5% VAT. Average in Africa is 17%. You can increase VATs. You can use technology, okay, and basically bring in more of the informal trade into the financial services sector.
But you do have to have trust between those that are governing and the taxpayers. I think that's also an issue.
Yes, but I thought we had dealt with those...
all right, sorry. Yes, we have put those to bed. We've got trust.
So when we started, for example, the Cashless Nigeria project, part of what we had hoped was if you get more and more people using POSs, you can use that to track sales and you can capture your VAT. Okay, so using technology, and that's one great thing Africa has. Kenya, all over Africa, mobile phones, POSs, you leverage that to bring more and more of the informal transactions into the formal sector. Now, on the private sector side, you've got a lot of money locked up in some countries, say in pension funds. Now, pension funds would not take out their money and just put in infrastructure. But you can use the government's balance sheet, give certain guarantees, give credit enhancement, and then bring that money into well thought out, well articulated projects like industrial parks, where you're providing all the infrastructure and bringing in investors who will set up industries and then generate the revenues that will pay off the...
As in the case of Ethiopia, yes, and the industrial parks, the second transformation plan.
Those are what you use your pension funds for example, and private equity.
Tax base here, bringing the informal sector in to play their role. And certainly, so from an Eritrea perspective, Minister Habtemariam, if you can come in and give us a sense of, I'm sure you are deploying best practice as well. Is there anything else we're missing? Of course, both His Royal Highness and a minister from Algeria have spoken about technology and how that is helping in transparency. Ease of regulation is another element, and simplifying the regulation, I'm sure, is something that we also need to discuss. So,
thank you. As far as tax is concerned, we don't have VAT in Eritrea as yet. We have what we call simplified sales tax and service tax, because we find it a bit complicated to administer as far as VAT is concerned, but eventually we'll make a study, and perhaps if it's viable, we'll introduce it at some stage. What we are trying to do to expand our tax base is trying to capture, as you said, the informal sector, and also some earnings or incomes that have not been taxed in the past, such as we don't have capital gains tax as yet, inheritance tax, money earned in the form of gifts, so on and so forth. We are trying to capture those earnings that are not being taxed at the moment. But as far as tax is concerned, Eritrea is becoming now a mining jurisdiction, and Eritrea is trying to get or to maximize its earnings from its participation in development of this sector. And we try to extract as much benefits for the country from our endowment in this area. The tax regime for this sector is higher than the other sectors. For example, in mining, we have 38% profit tax, whereas in the other sectors it's 30%. In addition, we have royalty, 5% for gold and silver. And,
thank you, Minister. I'm going to ask our Secretary of State to build on it from an Angola perspective. I'm also going to move to any burning questions in the audience. Please, can you put your hands up if you would like to put a question to any of our panelists? We have about 15 minutes to the end of our discussion. We do have a roving mic, so please just put your hands up. Madam Secretary.
Well, it's like the Emir said, so as an oil exporter country, and probably the experience is the same, we for years have neglected the non-oil revenues. And right now there is this huge and collective thinking that we have to go for more independence from the oil revenues. So VAT is scheduled to come into implementation, at least the starting of it on January 2019. We are doing it with the help of external consultants and also the IMF. We are also working very hard in order to expand the non-oil based revenue. We are working also hard in order to come, as the Algerian minister said, in order to bring more of the non-formal sector of the economy into the payment of taxes and its fiscal responsibilities, so putting it in a more formal way of staying and doing their own business. But again, it's a long history and culture of non-paying taxes, of non-being obliged to any kind of commitment when it comes to this camp. So besides all the reforms that are being put into place, it's necessary to understand that it's also necessary to change the mindset of our own people in order for them to start viewing their responsibilities as taxpayers and also their rights that comes with these payments.
How do we fast-track that agenda, Your Royal Highness? Because everybody's moving in the right direction, and as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, 54 different countries with different rules and regulations and at different stages of development. So you can't just apply one formula across the African continent, but how do we fast-track? Because the youth that you spoke about are impatient. And that could be our Achilles heel if we don't address it very, very quickly in terms of their benefit from resources and their inclusive growth.
I think, frankly, if you address the first two key issues, the third becomes easy. You know, we keep talking about raising revenues and capital accumulation. Capital accumulation never precedes industrialization. It continues to grow as you begin to expand industries. Now, if you, for example, improve transparency, block the leakages, put in money, say, in industry, it is those industries that will now create their own jobs and then create a basis for more tax revenue. And if you look at countries like Korea, Japan, China, Malaysia, how many of them had foreign investment when they started? Nothing, none of them. China actually blocked off foreign investment. All these countries developed with domestic resources. And it was not new money coming in or new savings coming in. It was basically looking at where all this latent capital was sitting, okay, and it had not been unlocked because of a very bad policy. If you've got, like I said, if you've got $1 trillion going to fuel subsidy, if you've got subsidies on foreign exchange, if you've got money going into basically overheads and waste, and you just decide to use that money more wisely, that is the takeoff that you need. And once you take off and continue, it happens. Finally, we keep talking about China. Look at Africa. The Transparency Index, you had 5 African countries doing better than many OECD countries. You had Botswana, Seychelles, Cape Verde, Rwanda, Namibia. And this is about perception, okay? And I think this is what I like about what the minister said. It's perception. You know, we can all deny that there's corruption in our countries, and maybe it's not true. But if people think that is what you have to address that perception. Everybody tells you that that Rwanda is fighting corruption. There must be some reason why everybody believes that. Why does everybody believe that when you go to Rwanda, there's very little corruption? Okay, it's because there's very little corruption. We can't all be collaborating to create a good name for one country and a bad name for another. So we all have to try to be like the Rwanda, okay, and ask what is Kagame doing that other leaders can do. And you know, in my country, Prime Minister Cameron described Nigeria as fantastically corrupt. My president agreed, and Nigeria wants to have his head. But my view is that what the president did is something we should be proud of. It was the first time an African head of state was able to say, yes, you know, we do have a problem. And if you don't accept that you have a problem, you won't even begin to solve it. And I think accepting that there is a problem and we need to do something about it is the first place to begin. And once we do that, the rest is easy. China did this in 40 years, 1 generation. We can do it in 1 generation.
And there's the speed with which we need to move. Are there any questions? I can take 2 from the floor. Are there any questions at this stage? And just while we are getting the mic there, I want to pick up on the Rwanda example and talk about a flight that I recently took from Johannesburg, routed via Kigali through to London. Now, not many people do the route via Rwanda Air. And I have to tell you, in terms of the policies that are working, I always look as a journalist for tangible evidence on the ground of what is changing, what is progress. And right down to the made in Rwanda sugar sachets on the flight on Rwanda Air and the butter that is packaged in Rwanda, you realize that if you're looking for evidence of manufacturing, of beneficiation, of adding value to those initial commodities, then Rwanda does celebrate that. Thank you very much for the mic. So can we take your question?
My name is Otiato from Kenya. I'd like to ask a question about expanding the tax net. In my country, most of the informal sector jobs are driven by people who are in the informal sector, like a side hustle or something. Do you think this drive to expand the tax net might actually hurt the informal sector in terms of people feeling that they are being overtaxed, and even actually drive it into the black market or something?
Thank you very much. I think a very, very valuable point, but it goes back to what we were saying earlier is, the informal sector needs to feel that they are benefiting from paying the taxes. And history has it that once you do see benefits from those taxes, you actually don't mind paying them, which I think was the point of what we were saying earlier. Any takers in terms of just adding to that?
I think it's worldwide. It's the same story. You go to Norway today; it's got one of the highest tax rates in the world, but they're very happy because they see where their money goes. Even in Nigeria, if you go to subnational, take Lagos State. 80% of the revenue of Lagos State comes from internally generated revenue. It's taxes. But the people in Lagos pay those taxes. They see the work being done on their roads. They see the work being done in their hospitals. They see the progress being made in Lagos, and they're happy to pay. Or maybe they're not happy to pay, but they pay anyway because they know that that money is being used, and then you've got the moral right to claim it. But if people pay taxes and they don't see any benefits, they're going to feel cheated, and they're not going to pay. And I think so it's important. I think that people should feel the benefit, but once they begin to feel that benefit, they will pay.
Signals, sir. I know you're under pressure. You are going to have to leave us, Your Royal Highness. So just a final word from you, and then if you could stand down from the stage, we'll just close with everybody else for another 5 minutes or so.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody, and I do hope that I've thrown some things on the table for discussion and for reflection. I think as Africans, we've got to, first of all, remember that everything we do has to focus on the African. And once we make the African our focus, then our trade policies, our industrial policies, our financial policies have to protect that interest. I also think coordination is important. I think the ADB, by bringing together African countries to negotiate on key issues of trade and industrialization, can have a lot of leverage. And all the people in this room, finance ministers, you have the biggest role to play, central bank governors, and I wish you all the best. I'm happy I'm not in your shoes now, the challenges that you're facing. It's easy for us outside to talk, I know it was difficult when I was there, but I do wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much.